Since the Legion expansion, dungeons have seen a complete overhaul in their design and how Blizzard approaches them in the form of Mythic Plus. It would transform the typical run-and-kill bosses with little to no thought to elaborate route planning, much more difficult mechanics, and insanely unique dungeon fights. In this video, we're going to be talking about some of the best Mythic Plus dungeons to have ever been in WoW, factoring in their overall enjoyment and unique styles for all levels of players. And at number 10, we have the Underrot from Battle for Azeroth in Season 2 of Dragonflight. The Underrot is located in Azmir of Zuldazar, where it was once a facility to research and contain old god specimens, now an overrun corrupted amalgamation in the form of rot and spores. In its original stages, Underrot may have been viewed as one of the much more difficult dungeons to ever exist in BFA, as the affixes were much harder to handle, and much more interrupts were needed to not struggle on certain mob packs. However, with its recent pseudo-revamp with Season 2 of Dragonflight, the affixes have been dumbed down tremendously, and much less coordination is required from a lesser skilled group to take down the instance. When you begin the dungeon, you will face off against many different NPCs. Maggots that explode on death, priests that heal, and blood matrons which charge at you and try to cleave you for heavy damage. You can do giant AoE pulls in the start, and oftentimes people would use their biggest cooldowns like Time Warp to bring it down. Once you reach the first boss, Elderly Exa, you will generally just need to avoid her AoE mechanics on the ground and kill the duplicates of herself while interrupting as much as possible. Not a very hard fight at all. From here, you'll encounter more maggots, disease lashers with a stun interrupt, living rot that spreads pools to avoid, and blood swarmers that constantly fixate targets. This requires you to have intense CC rotations with your group and quick cleave damage in order to not allow their dangerous mechanics to ever come to light. Once the room is cleared, you'll deal with Kragma. Kragma only has a few mechanics, a frontal and a charge. Whenever he does either of these things, he will leave maggots on the ground that must be ran over in order to prevent harmful ads from spawning. At 100 energy, the boss will rampage across the room and pulse heavy damage and leave these maggots all over the encounter space that players must spread out and stomp, later reconvening together once again to repeat the frontal and charge mechanics. From here, you'll have death speakers that must be killed quickly and grotesque horror that must be interrupted and CC'd in some manner. Even the less elaborate will have noticed this dungeon's theme, and it's a lot of CC. It made some classes approach this dungeon in a completely unique way that they hadn't thought of prior, and allowed certain players to more elaborately use their class's utilities. Players generally enjoy contributing more than just their damage to a group's efforts, and Underrot plays into this incredibly well. Even the third boss makes use of committing an immunity button like the Paladin's Divine Shield in order to soak all the mushrooms on the ground before the deadly Festering Harvest spells cast. The dungeon clearly had its share of a learning curve, and players would mostly find their troubles in pub groups, where everyone is much less coordinated and overall not paying as much attention, so it only earns a number 10 spot on this list. But with a skilled group, it becomes one of the easiest dungeons to ever be part of in a seasonal rotation. And at number 9, we have Waycrest Manor from BFA in Season 3 of Dragonflight. Waycrest Manor is a multi-level instant with 5 total bosses throughout its run. It is the sister house of the Proudmoore family cult Taras, and has since seen its share of deceit and witchcraft throughout its existence in recent years through the Heartsbane Coven. The overall aesthetic of the house and even its exterior is of gothic nature, and insidiously crafted horrors. These NPCs have been regarded to legitimately be some of the creepiest existing mobs in the game, and players have loved to venture into the instance just to be able to hear the music and see the manor in its glory. The instance is also known for its inventive routes and completely unique way to approaching the many levels of the dungeon, allowing you to either slay the mobs upstairs for the enemy force count, or electing to kill more mobs downstairs in the basement. You are entirely left to choose how you want to approach the dungeon as you see fit, and may attempt the Heartsbane Triad or Ral the Gluttonous first. You could even go for the Soulbound Goliath first if you really wanted by fighting your way through all the trash packs on the way to reach the courtyard. The mechanics of this dungeon are not overly complicated either, and all levels of players may thrive in the environment while still feeling challenged. In coordinated groups, it becomes even more of a thrill as you just battle through the manor. Just the lore and looks of this dungeon alone pushes itself onto this list, but is elevated by the inclusion of seriously engaging mechanics and rewarding good execution of said mechanics. For example, with the Soulbound Goliath, players will occasionally be stunned in roots that everyone must help break while the boss progressively ramps itself up in damage. It will forever increase its damage until you drag it through the fire that's spreading throughout the courtyard and burn the souls trapped within the monstrosity. Doing so will trigger heavy AoE damage to the group, and it forces it into the process of playing carefully into the boss's rampaging damage and committing resources when necessary in a very timely manner. You can choose to allow the boss to continue increasing its damage, but will need to protect your tank much more, as it may just one-shot them or burn the boss more frequently, and help your healers so no one dies to the AoE. It really just depends on your group composition, and that is truly what benefits this dungeon, as no matter what class you are, there are always newer ways to approach how to handle the mechanics, and there is a usage for everyone involved, thus rewarded with the number 9 spot on this list, but outshined by our other entries to come, unfortunately. And at number 8, we have Neltharus from Season 2 of Dragonflight. Neltharus is the home of the Black Dragon's hoard of gold and mystical treasures. It lies beneath the seat of the former Black Dragon aspect, Neltharion, and has since been taken over by the Jarradins, sworn enemies of the dragons. It is similar to most Mythic Plus dungeons to exist in WoW, and it's just the standard fashion. You have challenging trash packs and harder bosses throughout the instance, and you'll handle them accordingly with your group. What makes this dungeon stand out from the rest, however, is the inclusion of profession items and, more importantly, the burning chain mechanic found throughout the dungeon. When it comes to the professions, cooking and blacksmithing are what really shine greatly here. For players with cooking, you may retrieve the Kalashi Goulash and receive an extra action button that increases your movement speed, allowing quicker movement throughout the already massive instance during downtime. For blacksmithing, once you defeat Forge Master Gorek, you may retrieve the Blazing Aegis upon his anvil, and when used, it will throw it at your target and deal heavy damage to everything around it. These additions are certainly helpful, but what really makes this dungeon stand out are the unique routes revolving around the burning chains throughout the environment. You may have noticed throughout your journey these mentioned chains, and when you click them, it'll begin a small channel and then connect yourself to the chain. Walking forward from where you originally clicked the chain, you will notice your character has been slowed, but once you reach a certain distance, the chain will snap, stunning all mobs and dealing high damage to anything in its path. This created insanely fun routes where you just pull almost an entire room of enemies at once and get the entire group to stack the NPCs together and use the chains all at once, effectively one-shotting them or getting the pack and you're dead. This strategy couldn't be used on bosses, but it almost never had to be, as the bosses were not overly difficult. These chains greatly improved the effectiveness of your runs, and were very much required when reaching above the 15+ range of keystones. You could ignore these chains, sure, but there was no real reason to, as there was no marked downside to the chains other than a cooldown on use that prevents you from using them again for about 3 minutes. This is why many groups would just pull everything at once and then kill together, basically making the cooldown null. Neltharus has very intuitive routes due to these chains. What's more fun than just one-shotting 10 to 20 mobs at a time? And at number 7, we have Dawn of the Infinite, Galakrond's Fall from Season 3 of Dragonflight. Galakrond's Fall, or just Fall for short, is one of the most recent Mythic Plus dungeons to be added to the game, but has quickly become a favorite to many players. Fall is set in the time ways of the Bronze Dragonflight, and players must journey with both Nozdormu and Chromie to stop the Infinite Dragonflight from changing time as we know it. This eventually leads players to the point in time where Galakrond had just died, and we witness how massive he truly was, and what a terrifying foe he truly was. So thankfully he's already dead. Seeing a return to the Infinite Dragonflight is always a treat, and players are treated to some of the best designed boss encounters WoW has to offer in this instance. The most notable of the 4 bosses are the Manifest at Timeways and Galakrond, the Earthen Incarnate himself. Once reaching the Timeway boss, you will see rotating cones around the boss, and standing in the lighter version will grant you haste and cause mechanics to tick faster and deal damage to you quicker. Standing in the darkened version will not give you this haste buff, but also tick for less damage and the mechanics peter out much slower. The boss very quickly is understood to encourage risky gameplay and reward for more damage at the cost of taking more damage and mechanics. It also allows lower skilled players to play safer and just remain within the darker zone throughout the encounter the entire time to not actually endanger themselves other than when dispelled by a healer. Once you defeat this encounter, you'll be prompted to follow Chromie to the past and quite literally rewrite a part of history with her. You will bear witness to the corpse of the great Galakrond, and his very presence is enough to cause the other dragons around him to be reanimated and come back to life to feast on the players. Again, you're rewarded for riskier style gameplay by committing more damage by not spreading the corrosive infusion debuff to other players until necessary. Failing to do so will mind control the target and most likely result in a wipe, especially if it was the tank. You'll battle through some more trash mobs afterwards, and then be greeted to one of the best dungeon fights Blizzard has ever made. The goal of this fight isn't just to stand and hit the boss, but you are literally fighting just to stall Galakrond, as he will eventually kill you if you're not quick enough. It truly encapsulates his power, even with Chromie at your aid, which further increases the fun of the encounter. Throughout the fight, you'll rely on Chromie to help soak mechanics, and she'll provide you with a 50% increased haste buff as you go. Healers can heal Chromie, and she'll see their numbers shoot into the hundreds of thousands while keeping her alive, and it gives every roll something to look forward to. The routes of this dungeon are pretty lackluster, however, as there are only 2 unique ways to approach the trash of the dungeon, and you'll often just be holding your W key, rather than planning carefully. Fall earns its spot on this list for its incredibly engaging boss fights, but falls short due to no real uniqueness outside of that, as the trash is just generally the type that you see across many other Mythic Plus dungeons already. And at number 6, we have the Necrotic Wake from Seasons 1 to 3 of Shadowlands. Necrotic Wake is in the Temple of Courage located in Bastion. During the dungeon, we found that it's being plundered by the Maldraxxus armies for its anima, and the temple is more than in crumbles. As the player, we must journey throughout the dungeon and aid the Curian in their efforts to push back the undead forces. This can be seen evidently through the already defeated Curian and their automata leaving their weapons on the ground from either fleeing or being killed. These items are very crucial to why Necrotic Wake finds itself on this list and introduces a new way to approach the various mobs of the instance. If your character belongs to the Curian Covenant, you may summon your steward from the fallen automata and they'll provide the players with a discharged anima. These deal heavy AoE damage and constantly interrupt enemies around you, allowing for massive pulls and puts an ease on the player's mind knowing they will not have to interrupt any casts and just go crazy on the damage meters while they have the item. All the other weapons can be obtained no matter your Covenant standing. These weapons are limited in amounts, so it forces your party to very carefully plan how you want to use them. You can elect to send them on bosses or tougher trash packs, whatever you see fit goes. Most commonly, players will use the Bloody Javelin on bosses as it deals heavy physical damage and it makes the target mob take 20% increased damage, allowing players to burst down a boss that typically would have taken much longer to kill. You also have the Forgotten Forge Hammer, an item that will deal damage to your target and stun it for 8 seconds, which can be pretty massive on certain trash mobs, like the Skeletal Marauders. Finally, there was the Discarded Shield, which provides you with a 50% damage reduction from all sources when used and standing within its radius. With the existence of these weapons, the dungeon was specifically tuned to be much more difficult, and required you to effectively use them in order to time your keystone. It encourages careful planning and setup with your group, and depending on composition and heroism timings, you might just defeat a boss in less than a minute. It's incredibly inventive from Blizzard's part, and even though Shadowlands was received poorly throughout its inception, this dungeon has stapled itself in a favor of many high-end players for being easily one of the most fun but challenging instances they've created. And at number 5, we have Halls of Atonement from Seasons 1 to 3 of Shadowlands. The Halls of Atonement is a vampire-esque gothic cathedral that is heralded as the pinnacle of redemption for the souls of Revendreth. Here you will find the most prideful of Venthyr and souls alike undergoing their ascension, and as the player, we find the denizens all fiercely loyal to the Sire Neltharus, so we must put a stop to them. The most notable point when you zone in the dungeon is that you find there's a massive amount of mobs before you. Before you even reach the first boss, you will have very close to all of the percentage required for your enemy forces. It's not very often Blizzard does a sort of boss rush type of instance, and as soon as you manage to reach the first boss, you'll have a very small amount of trash packs afterwards, and it's just boss after boss from here on out. Because of this unique style, players can commit not just 1, but possibly 2 Bloodlust rotations to just the trash packs as they prepare for the bosses ahead. It was really refreshing to plan in such a new way that the rest of your group would do. On top of this, if your character belonged to the Venthyr Covenant, you could control the nearby Loyal Stoneborn, and for 30 seconds, they will cleave and shred all mobs you attack. On top of this, it also provides you with a 10% damage reduction in the form of Stoneborn Boon. A dungeon with added uniqueness for players to demonstrate their utilities is always a bonus, but in some cases it can also be a negative. Sometimes Blizzard will design a dungeon around the existence of buff like these, and not having the buff can make it much harder in your group, almost requiring the utility once you reach higher level keystones, but not always in the case of Halls of Atonement, which earns it extra points on this list. And at number 4, we have Court of Stars from all seasons of Legion and Season 1 of Dragonflight. Court of Stars is set within Siramar City during the events of the rebellion against Grand Magistrix Elasan, and players must infiltrate a high-tier party to learn specific information that will benefit the rebellion. Throughout the dungeon, you will sneak around the city by disabling the pylons that alert the guards, and quickly take them out before more notice. When it comes to the first boss, you can choose to have more or less of the pylons disabled based on what you think you can handle. For every remaining pylon, more guards will show up during the fight, which will aid the boss. If you leave at least 1 remaining, you can also skip a massive chunk of the RP dialogue that plays out before the last boss. This strategy allows you to choose what may save you more time and what your group may be able to handle. What makes this dungeon really shine above others, however, is the inclusion of many class and profession specific items that would benefit your group that spawn at random. Before you engage the first boss, you can click on a file next to the boss if you have alchemy or are a rogue that allows you to skip the enrage phase, as when he drinks it, it's now poisoned and it kills him instantly. As you approach the second boss, you must distract the council one at a time and not engage them all at once. In order to do this, you must kill the Fellbound Enforcers and the council bosses will make their way to you. Wounded Nightborn Civilian can be used by all healers and anyone with a tailoring profession. The Bazaar Goods can be used by a rogue, warrior, and anyone with a leatherworking profession. And a life-size Nightborn statue can be used by players with mining and jewel crafting profession. The special effect will be summoning a mini-boss which will reduce the number of fell-handed forcers you have to kill. Arcane Power Conduit can be accessed by the gnomes and goblin races and players with the engineering profession. The special effect will debuff all guardian constructs, stunning them for 5 seconds every 20 seconds. Waterlogged Scroll can be used by shamans and players with skinning or inscription profession. This special effect will grant your entire party 35% increased movement speed. Umbral Bloom can be used by druids and players with the herbalism profession. The special effect will grant your entire party 10% haste. Starlight Rosebrew can be used by Death Knights and Monks, granting your whole party improved health and mana regeneration. Nightshade Refreshments can be used by the Pandaren race and players with cooking or herbalism skills. This will grant your party 10% increased health. Discarded Junk can be used by hunters and players with blacksmithing professions. This special effect will summon a mini-boss at the Telex Framewreath boss fight, which will spawn an armed trap. Walking over it will do 10% of their health and increase the damage taken by 25% for 30 seconds. Magical Lantern can be used by a mage class, blood elves or night elf races, and players with the enchanting profession, giving your group a 10% increased damage bonus. Fel Orb can be used by Demon Hunter, Paladin, Priest, and Warlock classes, granting your entire party a 10% increased critical strike bonus. Infernal Tome can be used by Demon Hunter, Paladin, and Priest classes, giving your party a 10% damage reduction bonus. Obviously, there are a lot of different items that can be used throughout your runs, and makes every single person have something to contribute, no matter what you play. Every run is going to be something different, and even after this, you have the Spy event, where you must find a hidden demon amongst the partygoers. Doing so requires you to ask Nightborn NPCs about the spy as they describe their attire to you, and you locate the NPC with the matching outfit. People loved Court of Stars for its ever-changing environment and overall fun mechanics throughout the fights. It was never too hard, and it had really good loot as well, like the Jeweled Signet of Melandris, which was recently brought back for Season 1 of Dragonflight. It was remembered fondly from its day in Legion and was regarded as one of the easiest dungeons of the season, marking it higher amongst the list of favorites. And at number 3, we have Operation Mechagon Junkyard from BFA Season 4 and Shadowlands Season 4. Mechagon is an old island inhabited by mechagnomes that seek to revert the curse of flesh in all living creatures. It is up to players to thwart these efforts, as mechanization more than often leads to death, and their ruler, King Mechagon, has long but gone mad in his efforts. Mechagon was separated into 2 dungeons during its journey. The first half was Junkyard and the second Workshop. Both are equally enjoyed, but Junkyard had the special flavor of little robots that patrolled around specific areas of the dungeon. If you walked up to these bots and clicked them, they'll give you a buff based on which you clicked. There were 3 buffs in total. Greased gave you 5% haste and 10% movement speed. Reinforced increased your maximum health and healing received by 10%. Conductive made your attacks occasionally proc a lightning zap on enemies that dealt high damage. These bots, while potentially not appearing like much, were insanely crucial to timing your keys. Dying would remove these buffs, so playing perfect was very key, and these bops helped accelerate that style greatly. Conductive would often be a tank or healer's top damage, and even some quick-hitting DPS like Fury Warriors. It was insanely fun to pull massive groups of trash and AoE them down like crazy with your groups, and there were tons of class gimmicks that you could use to speed up your runs. One of the more niche uses was a Druid stampeding roar on the Squirt box to make the run towards the Gunker boss quicker. No boss really felt unfair, and if you were a solid player, you'd be rewarded greatly for your efforts and farm the loot within like crazy. Mechagon also had the Bit Band rings, which were very powerful tier set like rings that would proc off each other. Junkyard, being so enjoyed by players, benefited farming these rings greatly, and you'd see people going after it like crazy. It also had the Mechagon Peacekeeper mount, allowing collectors an alternative to farm their mount. In addition, every week had a different route no matter what. Over the head of each boss would be the final boss patrolling them. You could attempt the bosses with it present, but it would activate hard mode and force you to dodge mechanics much more frequently. If you wanted a smoother ride, all you had to do was go to a different boss rather than what was currently being patrolled. It was a very well designed dungeon with difficult trash, fun mechanics, but nothing obscenely challenging during its time. And at number 2, we have Freehold from all seasons of BFA and Season 2 of Dragonflight. Freehold was the pirates' hangout of Kulturas, and they had all begun to gather under a single banner. It's up to the players to avert these efforts while they can, and even portray themselves as pirates in order to fool the NPCs around them. This dungeon has grown to be a favorite amongst many for the simple fact you spend almost the entire time doing AoE and parsing huge numbers. Almost every pack has a large amount of mobs, and any class can shine through the damage meters here. The mechanics of this dungeon were never insanely troubling either. Any level of player can accomplish this dungeon and have a good time while doing so, no matter the affix. A fun note about this dungeon is that the first boss was actually a Hearthstone card originally, one of the rare times where lore in Hearthstone is made canon in WoW. After defeating the first boss, you'll cross a long bridge and be prompted to fight your way through more pirates. Since Dragonflight, this event has changed, and normally you would need to complete a weekly changing event to portray yourself as a pirate to the second encounter. There were 3 in total, and if you saw the dog Murphy, You would chase them around for the keys around their neck and be given a pirate hat to reduce the next boss's health pool. If you spotted a Volpera, you must drink and get drunk with them for 1 minute, and if you see 2 knuckle dusters, you'll start a brawl. Here, you'll fight waves of mobs, and once defeated, you'll be made a member of their crew. Just like the changing event, so would the boss that helps you in your efforts depending on the event you just completed. It added really special ways to do the dungeon, and each week was something different. But even when it was removed, you could still have a blast in the second encounter. A known trick was to pull a large amount of trash with the boss and use the given crit and haste buffs from Captain Jolly. There were also bad swirls on the ground, and dragging the same trash from before into it would make them take increased damage. The more padding, the better. It was literally just AoE galore, and the more you became familiar with the dungeon, the more at a time you could pull. Even after the second boss, there was plenty to look forward to still, and timing this dungeon was normally never a problem. With so many mobs throughout the instance, dozens of different routes which could be created and ran through time and time again, it certainly earns its spot at number 2, just for being a dungeon that anyone could approach and have fun in, allowing for insane plays and gimmicks overall. And completing our list at number 1, we have the Maw of Souls dungeon from Legion. With Legion being the hallmark of Mythic Plus, Blizzard was still attempting to learn how they wanted to approach these dungeons and would try new methods. Maw of Souls is infamously known for being one of the easiest and quickest Mythic Plus dungeons to date, with only 3 bosses in total, and not very challenging trash for its time. During its inception from Legion, it was hard to go anywhere without seeing people spam running Maw of Souls constantly for its loot and easy grind for artifact power. Artifact power was a massive grind for your artifact weapons that would slowly increase the power of your character over time, granting you new abilities sometimes, or even incredibly strong passive powers. This made Maw of Souls the perfect dungeon to run repeatedly because of how fast and efficient you could be with it, even in mid-tier groups. Beginning the dungeon, many groups would typically pull all the trash mobs before them up to the first boss and do an insane cleave damage, and even sometimes commit their heroism or time warp cooldowns for it. WoW players have enjoyed bigger numbers since it was even a concept, so the classic pull everything and do big damage trope is always a favorite. Even thematically, the dungeon just has an aesthetic that players greatly enjoy. When it comes to the first boss of the instance, Wrath the Lich King players may recognize him as King Yamaran from Urtkard Pinnacle. Here we find him punished for striking his bargain with the Lich King of old, and he even taunts players for destroying his kingdom and people during the time of Wrath. Generally, his mechanics are pretty simple, involving cleaving a bunch of ads he summons, running out to avoid a fear, and just healing through pulse and AoE damage that he creates. Once defeated, you'll travel to the horn that he guarded and blow into it, soon boarding your characters atop the very ship that transports the dead to Helheim. You'll fight more trash packs and even be given 2 paths to take, one with the undead giant the Grimwalker, and the other a more challenging trash pack. These paths would change every week, as only one of the doors to lead you up were opened at a time, creating a curve where players must become knowledgeable about how to approach both packs at one point. You will then approach the deck of the ship and must face Harbaron, a rumored Constellar. Constellars are powerful entities in WoW, and the most recognizable of them is Algalon from Old War. During the encounter, you must avoid large swirling pools and fight off ads that must be interrupted, and just in general use CC and lots of cleave damage to bring them down. Up next is more trash, cleaving down more, and then a mini-boss named Scourge who has an interrupt mechanics and summons more ads. Finally, you face off against Helia, the ruler of the very domain you're within. Here you must cleave down her tentacles that grasp onto the ship, and slowly whittle her health down while avoiding the cracks and breaks in the ship that she causes. Once enough of her tentacles have been defeated, you will face Helia herself and no longer the tentacles, and continue similar mechanics from before, but now with frontal cone attacks and higher damage thresholds. Once defeated, you finish the dungeon. The Maw of Souls holds a theme of high cleave throughout the entire instance, and players love to make their damage meters shoot up to show off to their friends. Almost any level player could approach this dungeon and complete it at even the highest keystone levels, because of how simple it really was when it came to all the skill of WoW players for the time. You could be a player who's only on a few times a week and only knows how to cleave everything in front of you and do just fine in the instance. Runs, even for the MDI, could be less than 10 minutes, where dungeons now can be upwards to 30 or more minutes. It was such an enjoyable dungeon that it's very likely to make a return someday in a future season of WoW. The instance was thematically stunning and is one of the most unique approaches to a dungeon in a long time, earning it the top spot on our list. Alright, and that completes our list. Mythic Plus is going to expand constantly and will forever exist in WoW's endgame and is viewed very positively from the community. More dungeons will come and go, and even old ones that were never Mythic Plus may eventually see the reworks they so desperately need to fit modern WoW. Now, were there any entries in this list you disagree with, or any other dungeons you wish made it here? Or do you have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, let us know down in the comments.